Wood TV8. This is a special presentation. Ford at 50. Extraordinary circumstances. Here's Rick Albin.
Welcome to Ford at 50. Extraordinary circumstances. It was 50 years ago today that Gerald R. Ford became the 38th President of the United States. The stormy path to the White House is something of political lore in this country. Never before or since has a president resigned, as Richard Nixon did just one day before Ford was sworn in. Jerry Ford had never run for the office of president, but he'd spent a lifetime preparing for just such a role. Here's a look to his rise in national political prominence. In 1949, a young Navy veteran named Gerald Ford arrived in Washington, D.C. to become a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. There he met at least two fellow members that would become both friends and mentors and become an important part of Ford's political life. Congressman John Kennedy and Congressman Richard Nixon.
You and others know.
Ford was part of a new breed of congressmen who had served in World War II and did not believe the United States could turn away from international struggles that they had seen firsthand. He described himself as a moderate on domestic affairs, an internationalist in foreign affairs, and a conservative when it came to fiscal policy. From 1949 to 1973, Ford served in the U.S. House and rose to minority leader. He was part of many major events in the second half of the 20th century. He served on the House Appropriations Committee. Senator Lyndon Johnson tapped Ford to serve on the Select Committee on Astronautics and Space Exploration that was the precursor to NASA. He was the last surviving member of the Warren Commission that Johnson, then president, appointed him to look into the assassination of his old colleague and then President John Kennedy. All the while, Ford held one political aspiration.
My total political ambition when I went to Washington was to become Speaker of the House of Representatives. I was a legislator. I loved being a legislator. And to sit in the Speaker's chair would have been the greatest accomplishment that I could imagine.
But with the chances of Republicans taking the majority in the House in the 70s being very slim, Ford and his wife, Betty, had considered retiring after the 1974 congressional elections. He would have been done in 1976. History had other plans for Gerald R. Ford. Ford was a partisan, yes, but he also worked across the aisle and, as important, had the respect and trust of Republicans and Democrats. And that's partially why, when the country faced another major crisis, Congressman Ford was called on, and it would change the trajectory of his career and American history. From our archives, here is how I describe that moment looking back at it from 2005. The country overwhelmingly elected Richard Nixon to a second term in 1972, despite rumblings about something called Watergate. But by the end of the first year of Nixon's second term, trouble was brewing in the administration. Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned his office after pleading no contest to tax evasion charges stemming from his days as governor of Maryland. Nixon, by now feeling the heat from continual questions about the break-in at Democratic headquarters, needed someone beyond reproach to fill the position of vice president, someone who would be confirmed by Congress and know how to work with the House and Senate. Most of all, Nixon needed an honest man. So President Nixon called on his old friend Jerry Ford, not to be the new vice president, at least not immediately. He asked Ford to talk to his colleagues and determine who the best person for the job would be. Here at the Ford Museum is the tally sheet, the result of those conversations. And the list contains some names that have been very influential in American politics. Names like George Bush, Don Rumsfeld, Ronald Reagan. But in the end, it was Gerald Ford who most appealed to Congress and to Nixon. As I said, that was from 2005, but years later, noted presidential historian and author Richard Norton Smith, who you'll hear from later in this program, gave us some insights on how then Congressman Ford may have had a heads up on some stormy waters lying ahead for the administration.
Gerald Ford was told in detail about Agnew's problems at least 6 months earlier than he ever acknowledged publicly. And from the beginning, he could see Agnew going down, and he could see himself replacing Agnew. Ford was a much more ambitious figure
Keep in mind the displays that I mentioned from here at the Ford Museum were nearly 20 years ago, and they update all the time, so don't expect to find them there now. But you will find new exhibits that look at and examine that extraordinary time. Now back to our report from 2005.
Raise your right hand, Mr. Ford. Place your hand on the Bible.
After an exhaustive background search and confirmation hearing, Ford was sworn in as vice president on December 6, 1973. Just 9 months after being sworn in as vice president, Gerald Ford was about to once again have a front row seat for one of the most dramatic moments in the history of the country.
The president's personal secretary repeated again that she was responsible for...
In the summer of 1974, the news was all about Watergate, secret tapes, cover-ups, and impeachment. Richard Nixon told the country that he was not a crook. But despite his protestations, investigators, Congress, and the country did not believe him.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
On August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon resigned the office of president. And Gerald R. Ford, the fiscally conservative, socially moderate Michigan congressman who had been called on before in times of national distress, became the 38th President of the United States.
So help me God. Congratulations, Mr. President.
In that job, he was charged with healing a nation disillusioned about the assassination of a young, popular president, an unpopular war, and a government that lied to them, and a president who didn't play by the rules.
I believe that truth is the glue that holds government together. Not only our government, but civilization itself. That bond, though stained, is unbroken at home and abroad. In all my public and private acts as your president, I expect to follow my instincts of openness and candor with full confidence that honesty is always the best policy in the end. My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over.
For President Ford, there were no easy decisions.
Pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2.
Pardoning Nixon a month after taking office raised the ire of millions. Some of their less than flattering letters and telegrams are at the Ford Museum, and they show just how unpopular the decision was. From a political perspective, it may well have been the end of Ford's career. Still, he believed that in order for the nation to move beyond the pain, Watergate must be put in the past. For that decision and others, much later in life, Ford was awarded the Profiles in Courage Award, given in the name of former President John Kennedy. From the evacuation of Saigon and the Mayaguez incident, New York financial crisis, energy concerns, swine flu, and inflation, Ford faced his share of challenges in the White House.
But I assume the presidency...
But he's also credited with restoring faith in government and trying to heal a nation. No small feat in 1974. Perhaps the biggest disappointment for Gerald Ford in his political life was the 1976 election, where he faced an unknown peanut farmer from Georgia who had served a single term as governor. A stinging defeat to Jimmy Carter followed, but something more extraordinary came out of that election. Joe LaFurgey will examine that next on Ford at 50, Extraordinary Circumstances. Welcome back to Ford at 50, Extraordinary Circumstances. In 1976, Jerry Ford's career as a politician ended at the hands of Jimmy Carter with his defeat in that presidential election. If Ford held it against Carter, it would have been hard to blame him. But the reality is that Ford and Carter formed a bond that would be hard to recognize in today's political environment. News 8's Joe LaFurgey has the story.
Both men offer a model for us today, for Americans really to embrace, study.
And it all began in the latter half of 1976. The run for the White House that year was like no other. Incumbent Gerald Ford, the Grand Rapids native in office by virtue of Richard Nixon's resignation, faced an uphill battle in his bid to win the presidency. First, there was a primary challenge from within his own party, from Ronald Reagan. The campaign leading up to the general election against Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter wasn't any easier. But Gerald R. Ford Foundation Executive Director Gleaves Whitney says the campaign was divisive by issues, not by personalities.
Campaigning in 1976 could be vicious, and it could certainly be divisive. However, it was not like what it's become now with the 24-hour news cycle and Twitter and all of the social media that tend to pile on every mistake or exaggerate for purposes of raising donor money.
In the end, Ford couldn't overcome the impact of inflation, his pardon of Richard Nixon, and a basic throw-the-bums-out anti-incumbency mood among voters. Ford narrowly lost to Carter on Election Day with just 3 percentage points separating the two. If there was any post-election bitterness between Ford and Carter, it began to thaw on Election Day.
For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he has done to heal our land.
And he also says that President Ford was such a decent man, this great contributions that he made to the country, and that he also had aspired to as president. President Carter had as well. And that bonded them in a very special way.
It was after that address that friendship began to form between the two men. President Carter gave Ford an open invitation to visit the White House whenever he was in town. He provided monthly briefings to the former president on domestic and foreign affairs. Whitney has studied correspondence between the two, and signatures show the evolution of their friendship.
All the best, Jimmy, or all the best, Jerry. And then it goes from all the best to your friend. And then by the end, it's please give my love to Betty, or give my love to Rosalind. And can't wait to see you.
Carter would go on to serve 1 term, but the bond between the now former presidents continued to grow.
Jimmy Carter would go so far as to say that there were never 2 former presidents. So after 1980, there were never 2 former presidents who had a more intense personal friendship than Jerry Ford and Jimmy Carter.
Like so many friendships, Carter and Ford's was based on shared life experiences. Both served in the Navy during World War II. Both committed to carry on with public service by running for public office after leaving the military.
They had a love for this country. I mean, second to none. They believed in this country. The optimism, the rootedness and hope of the American people.
The bond remained until President Ford's death in 2006. President Carter recalling his words during his 1977 inauguration while delivering the eulogy.
I want to thank my predecessor for all he has done to heal our land. Those were the first words I spoke as president. And I still hate to admit that they received more applause than any other words in my inaugural address.
Over nearly 3 decades, the former presidents would collaborate on no less than 25 projects, traveling extensively together.
And he and I commented often that when we were traveling somewhere in an automobile or airplane, we hated to reach our destination.
Whitney says the words of the past provide a significant lesson for today.
It's because it shows that people from 2 very different political parties at the time, and certainly how they've evolved to today, can produce leaders within the parties that know how to maintain a civic friendship through their differences.
In Grand Rapids, Joe LaFurgey, News 8.
When we come back, News 8's Brian Sterling has an assessment of the tumultuous time in 1974 and how it relates to today's political environment with noted historian and author Richard Norton Smith. That's next on Ford at 50, Extraordinary Circumstances. Welcome back to Ford at 50, Extraordinary Circumstances. Presidential immunity, political pardons, the importance of the vice presidency, all issues that confronted the United States and government in 1974. And 50 years later, some of those issues are still front and center. News 8's Brian Sterling sat down with noted historian and author Richard Norton Smith and talked about 1974 and some of the lessons that could apply in 2024.
All of the talk about bridges to the future or bridges to the past or whatever bridges, but there certainly are parallels between the melodrama of the summer of 1974.
As a historian and author, Richard Norton Smith is trained to look for the through lines in history, parallels that might predict our own future if we adhere to studying the past.
It's funny how things come full circle.
Smith, the esteemed former director of the Ford Museum, authored a book last year on the 38th president that is seen as the definitive biography of Ford, both the politician and Ford the man.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
I thought I knew him pretty well. and I learned a lot of things that I didn't know. Gerald Ford emotionally never left West Michigan.
Smith says it was President Ford's West Michigan upbringing, the boy who excelled at sports, the Eagle Scout, the Midwestern values that informed his presidency in ways that are still being dissected. Smith specifically pointing to the controversial pardon of President Richard Nixon as a decision emblematic of who the man was and how he led.
That I cannot rely upon public opinion polls to tell me what is right.
The only way that he could get rid of Nixon, not to forgive Nixon, but to forget Nixon, was to pardon him. There's a moral element to the presidency that ultimately transcends the purely short-term political one. And sooner or later, successful presidents, good presidents, whether they get reelected or not, decide that for themselves. And that was Ford's, in effect, moment of truth. Here we are 50 years later, and we're rewriting the script.
Smith spent a decade researching, writing, and working on the Ford biography, sitting at a desk overlooking the Ford burial site at the museum downtown.
I wrote the Ford book on that desk, and that desk is placed in front of the window that overlooks the Ford gravesite. And at least during that part of the year when the trees don't block it, that's what I can see. So, you know, I suppose there is that psychic connection in some ways. There was never any doubt that at the end of his life, he would be brought back to Grand Rapids.
Smith says he is often asked, what would President Ford make of the current state of American political discourse? He points to an interview that Ford gave Time magazine in 1980 about the qualities that would disqualify one from becoming president.
Ford thought for a minute, and he said, arrogance. And then, of course, immediately, being Ford, he said, not that the American people would ever elect an arrogant president. He said, but if they did, and he said, and I'm talking vicious arrogance, he said, then God help the country.
In Grand Rapids, Brian Sterling, News 8.
More on Ford at 50, Extraordinary Circumstances, when we come back. Welcome back to Ford at 50, Extraordinary Circumstances. When Gerald Ford became president of the United States, the world was watching. But just months earlier, when he took the oath of vice president, as dramatic as it was, it didn't rise to the same level of intrigue. But it was the speech that he gave immediately after taking the oath of vice president that gave us an insight into Gerald Ford's humility, his humor, and his ability to connect with the American people.
In exactly 8 weeks, we have demonstrated to the world that our great republic stands solid, stands strong upon the bedrock of the Constitution. I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln.
And perhaps a Ford was precisely what America needed at that very moment. Thanks for watching Ford at 50, Extraordinary Circumstances.